The desert wind carried dust and whispers of old stories through the small frontier town of Copper Ridge in 1887. Margaret Thornton stood on her wooden porch, her gray eyes scanning the horizon with the same cold expression she wore every day. At 52, she had built a reputation as the town's most successful businesswoman, owning the general store and 3 rental properties. But her greatest shame, as she saw it, was her 26-year-old daughter, Sarah. Sarah had never married, much to her mother's endless disappointment. While other women her age were raising children and managing households, Sarah spent her days reading books, helping at the local school, and caring for sick neighbors. Margaret viewed these activities as worthless pursuits that would never bring respectability to their family name. Another day wasted on foolishness, Margaret muttered as she watched Sarah return from the schoolhouse, her arms full of children's drawings and spelling papers. Sarah's brown hair was pinned back simply, and her plain blue dress showed signs of chalk dust and ink stains from her volunteer teaching. The tension between mother and daughter had grown worse over the years. Margaret's friends constantly reminded her of their own daughters' marriages and grandchildren, making her feel like a failure. She blamed Sarah entirely for this embarrassment, never considering that her own harsh treatment might have driven away potential suitors. News had recently reached Copper Ridge about troubles with the Apache tribe led by a warrior named Running Wolf. The government had been trying to relocate his people to a reservation, but Running Wolf refused to surrender. Stories spread about his fierce reputation and the battles he had fought to protect his land and people. Margaret saw opportunity where others saw danger. She had heard that some tribes would accept peace offerings or negotiations through marriage arrangements. Her calculating mind began forming a plan that she believed would solve 2 problems at once: getting rid of her unmarried daughter and potentially gaining favor with the military officials who would surely reward anyone who helped end the Apache conflicts that evening. As Sarah prepared a simple dinner for them both, Margaret announced her intentions with shocking coldness. "I've made a decision about your future, Sarah. Since you've failed to find a husband like any decent woman should, I'm going to offer you to that Apache chief. Maybe he can make something useful of you." Sarah dropped the wooden spoon she was holding, staring at her mother in disbelief. The cruelty of the statement hit her like a physical blow, but it wasn't entirely surprising. Margaret had made increasingly hurtful comments about Sarah's unmarried status, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. "Mother, you cannot be serious," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire in their small kitchen. Margaret's expression remained unchanged, as if she were discussing the weather or the price of flour. "I am completely serious. Tomorrow I will speak with Colonel Barnes at the fort. If they can arrange a meeting with this Running Wolf, perhaps we can end this conflict and finally make you someone else's responsibility." The callousness of her mother's words revealed the depth of Margaret's resentment. She spoke of her own daughter as if Sarah were a burden to be disposed of, not a human being with feelings, dreams, and worth. Sarah realized that her mother saw her not as a person deserving love and respect, but as a failure that reflected poorly on the Thornton family reputation. As Sarah stood in their modest kitchen, surrounded by the home she had helped maintain and improve over the years, she understood that her mother's proposal was not born of any concern for peace or politics. It was simply Margaret's final attempt to rid herself of what she considered an embarrassing reminder of her own perceived failures as a mother. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls as both women faced each other across a chasm that had been growing for years. Margaret's decision would set in motion events that none of them could predict, and Sarah's response would prove that her mother had gravely underestimated the strength and character of the daughter she was so eager to discard. The next morning brought no change in Margaret's resolve. She dressed in her finest black dress and hat, preparing to visit Fort Henderson just outside of town. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as her mother walked down the dusty main street with determined steps. Her back straight and her chin held high with the same pride that had made her so many enemies in town. Colonel Barnes received Margaret in his small office, surprised by her unusual request. The weathered military man had dealt with many strange proposals during his time on the frontier, but nothing quite like this. Margaret explained her plan with the same businesslike tone she used when negotiating prices for her store inventory. "Mrs. Thornton, I must say this is highly irregular," Colonel Barnes said, adjusting his uniform jacket. "Running Wolf is not some peaceful chief looking for treaties. He's been raiding supply lines and has sworn to fight until death rather than accept relocation to the reservation. Margaret waved away his concerns with a dismissive gesture. Men are men, Colonel. They all want the same things. My daughter is young and capable. Surely even an Apache can see the value in having a civilized woman to manage his household. The colonel stared at Margaret, trying to understand the cold calculation behind her proposal. He had seen many hardships on the frontier, but a mother offering her own daughter to a hostile warrior chief struck him as particularly heartless. Still, any possibility of peaceful resolution was worth exploring, no matter how unlikely. If you're certain about this course of action, I can arrange for a meeting under a flag of truce, he said slowly. But I must warn you, Mrs. Thornton, Running Wolf has refused all previous attempts at negotiation. There's no guarantee he won't simply see this as an insult and respond with violence. Margaret's confidence never wavered. Let me worry about that, Colonel. Just arrange the meeting. Meanwhile, Sarah spent the day in turmoil. She walked through the town where she had lived her entire life, looking at familiar faces and places with new eyes. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, greeted her warmly and thanked her for helping their youngest son with his reading. Old Mr. Peterson tipped his hat and mentioned how much his late wife had appreciated Sarah's visits during her final illness. These interactions reminded Sarah of all the connections she had built in Copper Ridge, all the people who valued her kindness and intelligence. Unlike her mother, they saw her unmarried status as irrelevant compared to her character and contributions to their community. As evening approached, Sarah made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. She would not run away or beg her mother to reconsider. Instead, she would face this impossible situation with dignity and use it to reveal truths that needed to be spoken. That night, as Margaret returned from the fort with news that Colonel Barnes had agreed to attempt contact with Running Wolf, Sarah listened calmly to the arrangements. A meeting would be requested for the following week at a neutral location between the town and the Apache camp. I hope you understand the honor I'm giving you, Margaret said, still speaking as if she were bestowing a favor rather than condemning her daughter to an uncertain fate. This could bring great recognition to our family name. Sarah looked at her mother with a mixture of sadness and clarity. For the first time in years, she saw Margaret not as an authority figure to fear, but as a woman so consumed by bitterness and social expectations that she had lost sight of basic human decency. I understand exactly what you're doing, Mother, Sarah replied quietly, and I understand why you're doing it. Tomorrow I will begin preparing for this meeting, but not in the way you expect. Margaret, satisfied that her daughter was finally accepting the inevitable, missed the subtle strength in Sarah's voice. She retired to her room, planning the social advantages she hoped to gain from her daughter's sacrifice. Sarah sat by the dying fire, considering the strange turn her life had taken. She had always been the dutiful daughter, accepting her mother's criticism and trying to earn love that seemed forever out of reach. But this final cruelty had freed her from those old patterns of hope and disappointment. For the first time in her life, Sarah Thornton began planning to speak her own truth, regardless of the consequences. She would meet Running Wolf if the arrangements could be made, but she would do so as herself, not as her mother's unwanted offering to be discarded for social gain. Word of Margaret's unusual plan spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. The town's small population thrived on gossip, and the story of a mother offering her daughter to an Apache chief provided endless material for shocked conversations. Some people expressed outrage at Margaret's coldness, while others whispered that perhaps Sarah was better off anywhere but under her mother's roof. Sarah spent the week before the proposed meeting in careful preparation, but not the kind Margaret expected. Instead of learning to cook traditional foods or practicing domestic skills, Sarah visited the town's small library and borrowed every book she could find about Apache culture, history, and recent conflicts with the government. She learned that Running Wolf, whose Apache name was Mapi, had become a leader not through inherited position but through his intelligence, courage, and dedication to protecting his people. The newspaper accounts painted him as a savage, but Sarah read between the lines and saw a man fighting desperately to preserve his tribe's way of life against impossible odds. Dr. William Hayes, the town's physician and one of the few people who treated Sarah with consistent respect, visited her during this time. He had heard the rumors and felt compelled to offer his assistance. Sarah, this is madness, he said. sitting in the Thorntons' modest parlor while Margaret was at the store. No one should be forced into such an arrangement, especially not as some kind of peace offering. I could speak to the colonel, or perhaps arrange for you to travel east to my sister's family in Boston. Sarah appreciated his concern, but she had already made her decision. Thank you, Dr. Hayes, but I won't run away. This situation has shown me something important about my life here, and I need to see it through to its conclusion. The doctor studied her face, noting a new determination that hadn't been there before. You've changed, Sarah. There's something different about you since this began. Yes, she agreed. I've stopped trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it, and I've realized that I have more strength than I knew. Colonel Barnes, meanwhile, had managed to arrange the meeting through a complex series of messages carried by Apache scouts, who occasionally came close to the fort under flags of truce. To his surprise, Running Wolf had agreed to meet, though his motivations remained unclear. The meeting was set for the following Sunday at noon, in a small valley halfway between the town and the Apache stronghold in the mountains. Both sides would bring only a few representatives, and weapons would be left behind as a sign of peaceful intent. Margaret spent her final days boasting to anyone who would listen about her clever solution to the Apache problem. She seemed genuinely convinced that her plan showed superior intelligence and would earn her recognition from both military and civilian authorities. That girl has been nothing but trouble since the day she was born, Margaret told Mrs. Carlton at the general store. Always reading books instead of learning useful skills, always helping others instead of finding a husband. At least now she'll finally serve some purpose. The cruelty of these statements reached Sarah's ears through town gossip, but instead of hurting her as they once would have, they only strengthened her resolve. She began to understand that her mother's rejection had nothing to do with her own worth, and everything to do with Margaret's own bitter disappointments and unrealistic expectations. On Saturday evening, Sarah packed a small bag with her few precious possessions: her mother's family Bible, a photograph of her father who had died when she was 12, and the letters of appreciation from families she had helped during illnesses and difficulties. These items represented her real life, not the failure her mother saw. That night, Margaret made one final attempt to give Sarah instructions about how to behave during the meeting. Remember, you represent our family name. Don't embarrass me with any of your strange ideas or independent thinking. Just be quiet and agreeable, and perhaps this Apache will find you acceptable. Sarah listened without responding, knowing that words would be wasted. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that had been building for years, not just between settlers and Apache, but between a daughter and a mother who had never learned to see her child as a person, deserving of love and respect. As she lay in bed that final night in her childhood home, Sarah felt a strange peace settling over her. For the first time in her life, she would speak her truth without trying to please someone else or avoid conflict. Whatever happened at the meeting, she would face it as herself, not as her mother's disappointment or society's definition of what she should be. Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that seemed to mock the tension hanging over Copper Ridge. Margaret dressed in her finest clothes, treating the occasion like a social event rather than what many considered a potential tragedy. She even pinned her best brooch to her jacket, as if meeting an Apache war chief required her most impressive appearance. Sarah chose simple, practical clothing, a brown riding dress and sturdy boots. She braided her hair in a single plait down her back and carried nothing except a small leather bag containing her treasured possessions. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with her mother's excited energy. Colonel Barnes arrived with a small escort of soldiers to accompany them to the meeting place. He had spent a sleepless night worrying about the wisdom of this arrangement, but military protocol demanded that he explore any possibility for peaceful resolution, no matter how unlikely. The party rode out from town in uncomfortable silence. Margaret chatted nervously about the weather and the condition of the road, while Sarah remained quiet, lost in her own thoughts. The soldiers exchanged worried glances, clearly uncomfortable with their unusual mission. The chosen meeting place was a small valley surrounded by red rock formations, with a clear stream running through the center. It was neutral ground, claimed by neither the town nor the Apache, making it suitable for peaceful negotiations. Ancient cottonwood trees provided shade, and the setting would have been beautiful if not for the tension that filled the air. They arrived first and waited in the shade while their horses grazed nearby. Margaret paced nervously, her earlier confidence beginning to waver as the reality of the situation set in. Colonel Barnes positioned his men strategically while maintaining the appearance of peaceful intent. Sarah sat quietly on a fallen log, watching the mountains where Running Wolf and his people lived. She had read that Apache families were close-knit, that children were treasured and protected, and that women held respected positions within their communities. The contrast with her own experience of family life was not lost on her. At precisely noon, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the canyon walls. Running Wolf appeared with 3 other Apache warriors, riding down from the mountainous terrain with the fluid grace of people who had spent their lives in the saddle. Even at a distance, his presence commanded attention. Running Wolf was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the scene before him. He wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and his long black hair was tied back with a leather cord. Despite the stories of his fierce reputation, he carried himself with dignity rather than aggression. The 2 groups approached each other slowly, stopping about 20 feet apart in the center of the valley. Colonel Barnes stepped forward first, following military protocol for such meetings. "Chief Running Wolf," he began formally, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Mrs. Thornton has come with a proposal that she believes might interest you." Running Wolf's gaze moved from the colonel to Margaret, then settled on Sarah with an expression that was difficult to read. He spoke English clearly, having learned the language during previous negotiations with government officials. "I agreed to this meeting because I was curious about what kind of people would offer their own daughter as a gift to strangers," he said, his voice carrying a mix of contempt and genuine puzzlement. "Among my people, children are precious beyond measure. We protect them with our lives." Margaret stepped forward, missing the criticism in his words entirely. She launched into her prepared speech about the benefits of peaceful cooperation and the advantages of having a civilized woman in his household. Her tone was that of a businesswoman closing a deal, completely inappropriate for the gravity of the situation. "My daughter Sarah is young and healthy," Margaret continued, gesturing toward Sarah as if displaying merchandise. "She can read and write, and she knows how to manage a household efficiently. Surely you can see the value in such an arrangement." The Apache warriors behind Running Wolf exchanged glances that clearly showed their disgust at Margaret's casual treatment of her own child. In their culture, such behavior was unthinkable and marked Margaret as someone beneath contempt. Running Wolf listened to Margaret's entire presentation without interruption, his expression growing colder with each word. When she finished, he turned his attention to Sarah, who had remained silent throughout her mother's humiliating sales pitch. "And you," he said, addressing Sarah directly for the first time. "What do you say about this arrangement your mother proposes? Do you wish to be given away like a horse or a bag of grain?" This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for all week. She stood slowly, feeling the weight of everyone's attention focused on her. Margaret shot her a warning look, clearly expecting her to remain quiet and submissive as she had been trained to do her entire life. Instead, Sarah stepped forward and looked directly into Running Wolf's eyes, recognizing in them the intelligence and pain of someone who had also suffered betrayal and loss. "Chief Running Wolf," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear despite the magnitude of the moment, "I want you to know that I did not ask for this meeting, nor do I support my mother's proposal. But I am grateful for the opportunity it has given me to speak the truth that has been hidden for too long." Margaret's face went pale as she realized her daughter was not following the script she had planned. Colonel Barnes shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the meeting was about to take an unexpected turn. The Apache warriors remained still, but their attention was completely focused on Sarah's words. "My mother believes she is offering you something valuable," Sarah continued. "But what she is really revealing is her own character. She sees me not as a daughter to be loved and protected, but as a burden to be disposed of. She speaks of civilization and value, but shows neither in her treatment of her own child." Running Wolf's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see in his eyes that he understood exactly what she was saying. She had read enough about Apache culture to know that family bonds were sacred to his people, and that maternal love was considered one of life's greatest treasures. "Among your people," Sarah said, looking directly at Running Wolf, I have read that mothers would die before harming their children, that families stand together against all threats, that children are seen as blessings, not disappointments. Margaret finally found her voice, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Sarah, be quiet. You're ruining everything with your nonsense. Chief Running Wolf doesn't want to hear your foolish ideas, but Sarah didn't stop. For the first time in her life, she felt free to speak her complete truth. My mother calls me childless as if it were a disease or a failure. She cannot understand that I have chosen to remain unmarried, rather than accept men who see women as property. She cannot see that I have spent my life caring for others, teaching children, nursing the sick, helping families in need because these things have no monetary value in her mind. Running Wolf raised his hand slightly, a gesture that commanded immediate silence from everyone present. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mrs. Thornton, he said, turning to Margaret with undisguised contempt, you have insulted me, my people, and most shamefully your own daughter. You think we are savages who would accept a woman as payment for peace? As if she were livestock to be traded. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Running Wolf continued before she could speak. You know nothing about my people or our ways. Apache women are honored and respected. They own property, make important decisions, and are never forced into marriages against their will. What you have offered me today is not your daughter. It is evidence of your own cruelty and ignorance. The truth of his words hit Margaret like physical blows. She had expected gratitude, perhaps even admiration for her clever solution. Instead, she found herself being lectured on morality by the very person she had considered beneath her notice. Colonel Barnes attempted to salvage the situation. Chief Running Wolf, surely we can find some common ground for discussion. Mrs. Thornton's methods may be unusual, but the goal of peace between our peoples is worthy. Running Wolf turned his fierce gaze on the colonel. There can be no peace built on the foundation of treating women as objects to be traded. Your people speak of civilization while treating their own daughters like property. We fight not because we are savages, but because we refuse to become like you. Sarah watched this exchange with growing understanding. She had walked into this valley expecting to be rejected, traded, or worse. Instead, she had discovered that the man her own people called a savage possessed more honor and humanity than her own mother. Chief Running Wolf, Sarah said, drawing his attention back to her. I want you to know that not all of my people share my mother's views. There are many in our town who believe in treating others with kindness and respect. Dr. Hayes, who cares for the sick regardless of their ability to pay. Mrs. Henderson, who shares her bread with hungry families. Mr. Peterson, who sees value in people beyond their wealth or status. Running Wolf nodded slowly, acknowledging her words. I believe you speak the truth, Sarah Thornton. It is unfortunate that those good people are not the ones making decisions about war and peace. The tension in the valley was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret stood frozen, finally beginning to understand that her plan had not only failed but had exposed her as someone even her enemies found contemptible. Colonel Barnes realized that any hope of peaceful negotiation had died with Margaret's insulting proposal. But Sarah was not finished speaking. She had one more truth to reveal that would shock everyone present, including herself. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything forever. The weight of 26 years of silence and endurance settled on her shoulders, but instead of crushing her, it gave her strength. Chief Running Wolf, there is something else you should know, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. My mother has spent my entire life telling me I am worthless because I have no children. She calls me barren and shameful. But the truth is, I do have a child. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face went from red to white in an instant. Colonel Barnes stared in shock, and even the stoic Apache warriors showed surprise at this revelation. 7 years ago, Sarah continued, I cared for a young Apache woman who had been wounded and was hiding near our town. She was pregnant and alone, separated from her family during a raid. I found her in the old barn behind our property, bleeding and frightened. Margaret tried to speak, but no sound came from her throat. She had never suspected that her daughter harbored such a secret. I brought her food and medicine and helped deliver her baby when the time came, Sarah said, her eyes never leaving Running Wolf's face. A beautiful little girl with dark hair and her mother's gentle spirit. The woman's name was Yellowbird, and she told me she was your sister. Running Wolf's controlled expression cracked for the first time, showing raw emotion. Yellowbird, he whispered. We searched for her for months. We believed she had died in the attack on our camp. She did die, Sarah said softly. 3 days after her daughter was born, but before she passed, she made me promise to care for the child. She said if anything happened to her, I should raise her daughter with love and teach her about both worlds, Apache and White, so she could choose her own path when she grew up. The revelation hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. You said the child died. You told me she died with her mother. I lied, Sarah said simply, turning to face her mother directly. I knew you would never accept an Apache child in our home. I knew you would try to turn her over to the authorities or worse. So I told you they both died, and I arranged for the child to be raised by Dr. Hayes and his wife, who had been unable to have children of their own. Dr. Hayes had been one of the few people Sarah trusted completely. He and his wife Mary had been desperate for a child, and when Sarah appeared at their door with the infant, they had asked no questions. They simply opened their hearts and home to the little girl they named Emma. For 7 years I have visited Emma regularly, Sarah continued. I have helped raise her, taught her to read, told her stories about her mother's people. Dr. Hayes knows the truth, and Emma knows that I am not her birth mother but someone who loved her mother very much. Running Wolf sat perfectly still on his horse, processing this information. His sister, whom he had mourned as dead, had lived long enough to give birth to a daughter who was now 7 years old and living in the very town that considered him an enemy. Where is this child now? He asked, his voice tight with emotion. She is safe and loved, Sarah replied. Dr. Hayes and his wife adore her. She is healthy, intelligent, and happy. She knows she is Apache and she is proud of her heritage. Margaret finally exploded. You deceitful, lying girl. How dare you bring shame on our family by harboring an Apache bastard? If anyone in town knew about this, be silent, Running Wolf commanded, his voice cutting through Margaret's hysteria like a blade. You have no right to speak of shame when you have just tried to sell your own daughter like cattle. He turned back to Sarah, studying her face with new understanding. You risked everything to save my sister's child. You have given her a home and a family when your own people would have rejected her. Why? Sarah's answer came from the deepest part of her heart. Because she was innocent and needed love. Because her mother trusted me with the most precious thing she had. Because it was the right thing to do regardless of the consequences. And now? Running Wolf asked. What do you want now that you have told me this truth? Sarah looked around at all the faces watching her. Margaret's furious disbelief, Colonel Barnes's confusion, the Apache warrior's newfound respect, and Running Wolf's intense attention. I want you to know that your sister's daughter is safe and loved, she said. I want you to decide what role, if any, you wish to play in her life. And I want to finally stop pretending that my mother's version of who I am has any truth to it. The confrontation that had begun as Margaret's cruel attempt to dispose of an unwanted daughter had become something entirely different, a moment of truth that would reshape the lives of everyone present. The silence stretched for long moments as Running Wolf processed everything he had learned. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that touched everyone present. Sarah Thornton, he said formally, you have shown more honor than anyone I have met from your people. You saved my sister's child and gave her a life filled with love when you could have turned away. For this, my people and I are forever in your debt. He dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward Sarah, stopping just a few feet away. The Apache warriors behind him remained mounted but relaxed, understanding that their chief had found something unexpected in this strange meeting. I would like to meet my niece, Running Wolf said quietly, not to take her away from the family that loves her, but to know her and to tell her about her mother and our people. Would this be possible? Sarah nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Emma would love to meet you. She has so many questions about her mother and your people. Dr. Hayes would welcome you in his home. He is a good man who believes in treating all people with respect. Margaret, who had been standing frozen in shock, suddenly came back to life. This is madness. You cannot seriously consider bringing a savage into town, around decent people and children. Running Wolf turned to Margaret with an expression of complete disgust. Mrs. Thornton, your daughter has more courage, wisdom, and honor in her smallest finger than you possess in your entire body. She has done what you could never do. She has built bridges instead of walls, chosen love instead of hatred, and shown true strength instead of cruelty. He looked back at Sarah with something approaching reverence. Among my people, we have a saying, the worth of a person is measured not by what they have, but by what they give. You have given everything, your safety, your reputation, your peace of mind, to protect an innocent child. This makes you more valuable than all the gold in these mountains. Colonel Barnes stepped forward, realizing that an extraordinary opportunity was presenting itself. Chief Running Wolf, if you would consider it, perhaps we could arrange a formal meeting in town. Not for negotiations or treaties, but simply for you to meet your niece and for our people to see that there are other ways to resolve our differences. Running Wolf considered this carefully. I will come to your town, but not as a chief seeking peace with enemies. I will come as an uncle meeting his brother's child and thanking the family that saved her life. What happens after that depends on whether your people can learn to see beyond their fear and hatred. Margaret made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Sarah, I forbid you to be part of this insanity. You will come home with me now and forget all this nonsense about Apache children and family honor. Sarah turned to face her mother one final time, and when she spoke, her voice carried the strength of someone who had finally found her true self. No, Mother. I will not come home with you because that house stopped being my home the day you decided I was worthless enough to trade away. I will not be silent anymore while you treat me like a failure or a burden, and I will not pretend that your cruelty is love. She paused, looking at the woman who had given her life but never truly seen her value. I have spent 26 years trying to earn your approval and affection. I have been dutiful, helpful, and quiet, hoping that someday you would look at me with pride instead of disappointment. But today I realized that the problem was never with me, it was with you. You are incapable of love because you are too consumed with hatred and bitterness. Margaret's face crumpled as the full impact of her daughter's words hit her. For the first time, she was seeing the consequences of years of emotional cruelty and rejection. I will stay in town, Sarah continued, but not in your house. Dr. Hayes has already offered me a position helping with his practice, and Mrs. Henderson needs assistance with her bakery. I will build a life surrounded by people who value kindness over status and character over appearances. Running Wolf mounted his horse and looked down at the small group gathered in the valley. Sarah Thornton, you have given me the greatest gift possible, knowledge that my sister's daughter lives and thrives. In 3 days I will come to your town to meet Emma, and I will bring gifts to honor the family that saved her life. He turned his horse toward the mountains, then paused for one final statement. Mrs. Thornton, you came here today believing you were offering me your daughter, as if she were a possession to be traded. Instead, you have shown me that she is a treasure beyond price, one that you were too blind to recognize. Your loss is profound, and it is entirely of your own making. As the Apache riders disappeared into the mountains, Sarah stood in the valley feeling lighter than she had in years. She had finally spoken her truth, claimed her worth, and found her voice. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in her life it belonged entirely to her. Margaret stood alone, facing the reality of what her coldness and cruelty had cost her. She had lost her daughter not to an Apache chief, but to her own inability to love and value the remarkable woman Sarah had always been. The meeting that was supposed to solve Margaret's problems had instead revealed them in all their ugly truth, leaving her to face the consequences of a lifetime of emotional failures. Meanwhile, Sarah walked toward a new life, surrounded by people who had always seen what her mother never could, that her worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition, and her strength had been there all along, waiting for the moment she chose to claim it.